pjnet.tv. Sorry for the late start. We will skip the pleasantries, switch to Studio 8 in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Welcome to pjnet.tv, the calm, cool, and collected Coach Prasick at the helm in spite of an emergency, but nothing that a good old pair of wire cutters won't fix. Folks, we're getting a late start. We will probably be starting JD at the bottom of the hour, not at the bottom of the hour, so that we'll have plenty of time for a special guest, first-time guest, that we have the privilege, pleasure, and honor of having here with us. Now, in the hurry of things, I didn't actually add her to the picture, but we're going to fix that on the fly. No worries. And with us, Callie, pronounce your last name. We did this exercise earlier, but I forgot. It's pronounced like it's spelled.
It is Callie Daruk.
Daruk. I remember now. I do. And, okay, Callie, I'm just making a few adjustments on the fly. Callie, you have been on a journey. Now, I happen to know how old she is. I won't say because she told me, and I assume that you were honest, but Callie, you've been on a journey as a Christian for some time, but every Christian journey and every life has turns and has obstacles, and your life has been no exception.
Yes, that's very true. I often refer to myself, Coach, as a recovering Pharisee because although I grew up in the church practically all my life, it really wasn't until I was 32 years old that I found myself face to face with the darkness of my own heart, a reality that I thought I had come to terms with, but I had never truly seen. So yes, our family has certainly seen its share of trials.
Now, along the way, you were keeping track, or at least recently, you were keeping track of your daily journal, in which you refer to as your memoirs. How long have you been doing that?
Well, I mean, I've been working professionally on writing my memoir for quite a while. I would say 3 or 4 years. But I've been writing practically all my life. Words have mattered to me and been very important in my life, but really took a turn of importance, I would say, about 8 to 9 years ago. In the year 2007, my husband and I found out we were pregnant with twin boys. And our journey as parents definitely took us on a wild ride we couldn't have expected. We had a little boy, Elijah, and then we discovered we were pregnant with twin boys, 2 more boys. And at 30 weeks, my water broke unexpectedly in the middle of the night, and that took our family on a journey unlike anything I could have imagined. And to keep it high level, because it's quite a story, our twins ended up being premature by 10 weeks, and one of our sons developed a deadly illness called necrotizing enterocolitis, and that resulted in a 324 consecutive day stay in 2 hospitals. He spent the first 7 consecutive months of his life at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital here in Nashville. And he was then life-flighted to Boston, Massachusetts to undergo an experimental drug and came home for the first night at 324 days after 13 surgeries. It's quite a story, but I say all that to say that in the midst of that journey, I thought I knew Christ, and it was something that I professed. But in the darkness of all of those days and the trauma of all of those circumstances, God exposed my heart for the condition that it was in. And like I tell a lot of people, most homes look sturdy on the outside, but it's not until a storm of epic proportion comes along and breaks down its walls that its foundation was truly exposed. So God exposed my foundation for what it was in those days. And that's really when my writing career began.
How was your husband in all of this?
How is he?
How was he during all this?
You know, as men and women, we handle trauma very differently. And he wanted to fix the situation that he just simply could not. After 13 operations, and we were told on multiple occasions that our son would not live. At 7 months of age, after being at Vanderbilt for 7 months, we were actually told, get anyone you ever want to see this child, get them here and say goodbye. He was in liver failure. And it's actually a beautiful story. Excuse me. It's actually a beautiful story. But yes, he definitely handled things very differently, and he wanted to fix them and knew that he couldn't. And it was really hard on him as a man.
You said it right. Men do want to fix things, and sometimes I know in my own life, in my spiritual journey, it's those times that you are not able to fix it that you realize how much you need God. This was an extended and very prolonged crisis. You must have taken a roller coaster ride emotionally.
Absolutely, I did, for sure. I thought I knew Christ, but when you are forced into situations like that were unexpected, it really reveals who you are under those type of situations. And even when our son came home, he had an extreme amount of special needs. He had a health condition that he still suffers from today. It took me for a loop, and there came a point where God just revealed himself to me in a beautiful way. I had more on me than I could handle, and I at 32 years of age, fell on my face in my bedroom floor and surrendered to Christ, despite having professed to know him all my life.
We certainly, most Christians certainly know about Jesus Christ, but knowing about him and knowing him in a deeply personal way, did you experience anger at God?
I experienced a tremendous amount of anger because life had not turned out as I expected. In fact, that was the title of my memoir at the time, Shattered Expectations. It wasn't supposed to be this way. So coming to terms with motherhood, all of the expectations that I had being shattered, coming to terms with all of that was extremely difficult. And I grew up in a church where I guess I would say I was in a bit of a theological crisis as well, because I didn't understand why I couldn't have enough faith to make my son better, to make him whole. Mm-hmm. And so I took that on myself as I must be failing as a Christian. And while I never turned my back on God, I most certainly was over playing the game and the charade, and feeling like so many women, if I went to church and they would ask me, you know, how are you? I remember feeling like, if you only knew. And I was over the game. I was over the game for sure. But since I was a little girl, I always trusted God, and I always loved him. And I knew that I was his, and I knew that he was mine. But I truly didn't know him intimately. And when I was forced into a situation where there was more on me than I knew how to handle, you know, so many people will say, God will never put more on you than you can handle. But through this journey, I've discovered that the way I say it is that sometimes God does just that. He allows more on us than we can handle to show us that we cannot handle this life without him.
What about those around you, family, friends, church? I can only imagine. Yeah, I'm going to speculate. Initially, they circle the wagons around you, but this lasted 7 months.
It did, and that made it extremely difficult. In fact, just to go into a little more detail about the beautiful miracle story, is that after 7 months of our son being told he's going to live, he's not going to live, just this roller coaster of life as a result of his prematurity, at 7 months of age, a beautiful thing happened. We were told on a Wednesday night that our son was in liver failure and there's nothing more they could do to get anyone that wants to see him and say goodbye. And so I went to church that night, just desperate and broken. And my husband was at home with his twin brother, who both of the twins had one surgery to have feeding tubes put in. So we had a 2-year-old at home, Isaiah's twin brother with a feeding tube, and then our deathly ill baby in the NICU, who had been there for 7 months. And I was broken, to say the least. And I went to church that particular night, and the pastor's wife came to me after the service and patted me on the leg and asked me, what was today's news? And I told her the news from the doctors. And she looked at me and said, well, Callie, if you hadn't done this, this, and this, your son would never be in this situation. And so that was a breaking point for me, because I was already taking the failures and the loss or the lack of my son's healing upon a failure on my end. But that night, God had other beautiful plans, because I came home and my husband was standing in front of the doorway and he was smiling, and I hadn't seen him smile in 7 months. And he said, "You're never going to believe what happened. While I was gone, an email came from one of Isaiah's nurse practitioners at Vanderbilt. And she said, off the record, if you tell anyone I told you this, I'll lose my entire medical career. But I happen to know of an experimental drug, not FDA approved in the clinical trials. 87 of the 89 babies in this trial is completely reversed their liver failure." And she said, "I couldn't live with myself without telling you about this." So my husband, while I was at church, did some research into the drug, and the hospital, Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts is where it was at. And he did some research, sent the doctor an email, and continued to finish up his work on the computer, headed downstairs, and his phone rang. And he answered the phone, and it was Dr. Mark Pewter from Boston Children's Hospital. And his words to my husband were, "I'm not God, but I believe I can save your son's life." And so my husband and I just dropped to our knees at the bed, and we knew that that was our last hope. And as parents, you will do whatever you can, take your child wherever you have to. So the very next morning, we went to the head of neonatology and talked to him, not telling him how we discovered the information, but that we had. And he said, "As a clinician, I have no hope in this drug whatsoever. But as a father, I would do what you're about to do, absolutely." So our son was then life-flighted to Boston, Massachusetts for an additional 4 months. And truly, by God's grace, he to this day has no signs of liver failure. But when he came home, he was the equivalent, though he was almost 1 year old, he was the equivalent of a very young baby, because he'd spent his whole life in a hospital and had lots of special needs. And there were therapies day in and day out, central lines, feeding tube, home health nurse, every therapy you could imagine. And I was not okay. I was just not okay. I had a child who had highly special needs. I had his twin brother who also had a feeding tube, and a 2-year-old. And that's when the crisis of my life hit. Sort of when everyone else thought, "Wow, your miracle's home. We can go home now." That's when things really downhill spiraled for me.
How many times do we in church approach someone we know and, how are you? But, I think that is a pleasant thing to do and the customary thing to do, but we really don't want to know, do we? What if somebody really told us how they really were?
I think we turn real fast in the opposite direction, which is sad. It's very sad. I don't know that we would know, church people would know how to handle that in general. And I remember feeling that way because, my circumstance was not like 99% of the other mothers, which is difficult all by itself to be a mom. And I definitely experienced that in the church where I would be asked, "How are you?" But before I could respond, they would be halfway down the hall and didn't really care. And as you said, had I told them, I'm not sure they would have known what to do with that.
Well, I'm very sure they're not in fact listening, because I did a little experiment once at church. When people would ask me, I'd say, "Well, I'm nauseous and about to throw up," and they would just say, "Oh yeah, yeah." And it's like they didn't hear it. Folks, before we went on the air, we typically do what we call dry run. And Callie and I had a very, very interesting conversation, and I asked her, was there anything, not for the table here? Should I take anything off the table? And she didn't hesitate. "Callie, you said no. Everything's on the table. Your life is an open book, and let's see. I should have saved that one for later." Did you stick with that church?
I did not.
Good.
No. In fact, when I was in the situation where I had so much on me as a mother, and I was starting to spiral downhill mentally, emotionally, physically, I was still putting on the facade. I wanted to believe that I was okay, and but it just became evident over time that I was not okay. I did have a lot of anger. And that's the hard part to admit, but that is the darkness of our own hearts. That when life goes in directions that are so very different than what we hoped or planned or dreamed, what do you do with that? And so instead of dealing with that, I pretended that I was okay. I continued to play the game, to walk the walk and talk the talk. All the while, my heart was just growing darker and darker.
That's not exactly the way to magnetize a circle of wagons around your situation. Who was there for you? I think situations like this, you really find out who's really with you.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, we had a good support system. I would say even that church was very gracious to us financially because this took a toll on our family in every single way. And they were very generous in that way. We have parents and siblings that were, they had to pinch hit. If you could imagine for a moment, I lived in Boston, Massachusetts with my son who we had been told was dying. And we're in an experimental trial. We have no idea what the outcome is going to be. I'm separated by over 1,000 miles while my family is back home. My husband, Isaiah's twin brother, and my 2-year-old in just north of Nashville, Tennessee. So we had to have family. We had to have friends. We had a good support system. And the sad thing is, despite that, I continued to spiral because it was pride. I wanted everyone to think, "Callie, she's strong. She's got this. She's good."
Do you feel like you've come through it now?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Although I often say now that if my spiritual journey is equivalent to the alphabet, I'm the lowercase a because I have so far to go. There's a wealth of wisdom to be gleaned and knowledge to be learned, but I'm on the right path this time. In the midst of my darkest days, and with all of the anger and all of the bitterness, I really just became someone I didn't ever think I would become. I said things I never thought I would say, did things I never thought I would do. I did not know how to handle that level of stress and trial. And when I was squeezed, unfortunately, it wasn't grace and love that poured out. It was anger and bitterness. And on one beautiful day, one painfully beautiful day, a dear friend of mine had had a dream, and she shared it with me. And at the end of that, I fell on my face in my bedroom floor. And when Jesus Christ should have rejected me, he loved me and he accepted me. And I didn't even know that it was possible to profess for your whole life that you knew someone you actually didn't know. And I often say, this was February 14th. It was on Valentine's Day of 2011. And I say that I fell in love with love himself. And that has been a 9-year journey of erasing all of the presuppositions I had theologically, of learning who God is, sitting with his word. And 4 days after that is when the writing began. God had exposed me, just like the Pharisees. Jesus said to them, "Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and make it appear beautiful before men, but inside is filth and hypocrisy and dead men's bones." And he went on to say, "These people, they draw near me with their mouth only, but their hearts are far from me." And that is exactly what I had done. It was all lip service. It was not who I was. It was not what I lived and breathed. And so 4 days after I fell on my face, seeing the darkness of my heart and truly accepting the love of Christ, I began a journal. And my first entry was, "Lord, I want to give you my whole heart, but I don't know how." So from that moment until now, I'm on journal 22 and continuing to pour out my heart before the love of my life and falling more and more in love with him every day. And when you experience that, it's a beautiful thing to turn around and give it. And so that's why I write, that's why I share, and that's why I speak, because there is hope and there is true love and true grace to be found.
It's hard for me to keep going listening to your story. You realize that my eyes begin to leak a little bit. You chronicled, journaled, and memoired your way through this. Today, there's a book. What does God want you to do before you die? Now, obviously, that tends to get attention, but why did you choose that title?
That title actually came from the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, because I was writing my memoir expecting to go down that path. But I had the honor about 2 years ago of attending a secular speech at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. And the whole idea of this speech was, what do you want to do before you die? And it was a beautiful speech, very inspirational, without a doubt. But when the speaker began to ask the crowd, what do you want to do before you die? And they began making epic bucket lists and were sharing all about what they had done and the adventures they'd gone on. Every time he would ask that question, Coach, I would hear in my heart, what do I want you to do before you die? And I knew I had learned the voice of the Lord. I had learned the voice of the Good Shepherd, and I knew what he was asking me. So the speaker continues and he asks, what do you want to do before you die? And just so beautifully, the Lord just continued to ask me, what do I want you to do before you die? And having been face to face and watching our son go through what he did, I knew the fragility of life. I knew how close you are from one moment changing everything. And there was one particular episode with my son, Isaiah, where he had went through a terrible night. He had to be resuscitated 17 times. He coded. And my husband and I were in the room when this happened. And we watched the heart rate flatline, oxygen rate flatline, respiratory rate flatline. Within seconds, a team of 20 or so people flood the room. They're all working on my son, trying to figure out what's happening. A lifelike doctor is over top of him performing CPR. He ended up breaking 6 of his ribs. Nothing's happening. And I describe it like this in my memoir. It was as if a blue sheet of death was pulled over him, because you could watch the pallor of his skin change. And another doctor burst in the room, and he looked at the nurse and said, "What did you give him?" The nurse had given him an extra dose of fentanyl because he had just had an operation, and he was on a fentanyl epidural drip. And you may recall fentanyl being a street drug that kills many right now. But that was his epidural drip to keep his pain level under control. Well, as a result of him having to be resuscitated 17 times, she thought maybe he's just in pain, because it's really hard for them to know what's going on with babies. They can't let them know. It's a guessing game. So she gave him an extra dose of this, and when she did, he flatlined. So the doctor screamed, "Get the Narcan," which we also are familiar with. Police officers carry that day in and day out. He screamed for her to go get that. She ran out. She came in with a vial. She put it into his little IV port, and just in a moment you heard the beep that you'd waited so long for. And it turned out it was over 20 minutes that our son went without oxygen to his brain. And everyone came to us crying. We were crying. Everyone in the room was in tears. And they said, then the doctor said, "Mrs. Daruk, Mr. and Mrs. Daruk, they're crying because of the trauma of that, yes. But they're also crying because your son will be brain damaged as a result of all of this." And so even when we brought our son home, we had no idea. We thought that it would be forever.
Right.
So I said that to say that we saw how thin, King Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes that there's a time to live and a time to die. And as parents, we expect that gap to be very large, but there's no guarantee that it will be. And so that fueled my perspective on death. And I also want people to know that living in light of eternity, when we understand that death is imminent, one of the quotes that I love to speak about when I talk about the book is Matthew Henry said, "Death will come certainly, but it may come suddenly." And what is it that we are supposed to do? What has God called us to do? And are we actively pursuing that? So all of those things fueled this beautiful project.
It's all this stuff in this book.
It is. It is. I don't go into a lot of detail about this story. That is reserved for my memoir, which is written. It's not published yet. But I absolutely hit the high points because that's what qualified me to understand this topic in a very intimate way.
Callie, we're out of time, and do you share this often?
Everywhere and every time the Lord allows, yes. And I have felt that escalating.
It must be
but
difficult.
I do. It is.
So what did God want you to do before you die, Callie?
Thank you for asking that. It is to proclaim the love of Jesus to every heart that I can possibly get in front of. That he loves you, that he is real, and he can wash the darkness of every and any heart and make you new, truly new.
You know, a lot of people say that, but when you say it, I know that you've lived through it and you've experienced it, and now you're sharing it. glad we got a chance to share. Callie, I hope that you will take an opportunity to visit our chat room and meet some of the people that have heard your story and see their reaction to that. And you gracefully and almost, I don't want to use the word cheerfully, but you're at peace, and it shows. It shows in your face. It shows in your eyes. And it resonates in your voice. I've met some pretty strong people in my life, and you can't fake what you've got. And I appreciate you sharing that with us tonight. I really
Thank you,
do.
Coach.
Thank you so much. Folks, there are times here at pjnet.tv that, I realize just how fortunate we are to know one another and to have one another. And what you have just heard is a powerful story. And if that doesn't impact you, you probably are brain dead. You probably need to do a checkup from the neck up. Folks, it's not over. I'm sorry we got a little bit of a late start. We actually had quite a panic here. Our main camera, that one, went out. Okay. And but we quickly reassembled. So we are running a little bit late, but we will have J.D. Winninger coming up in just a few moments, and he is here every Thursday night, and he will take us on a trip around the Cross W Ranch. Thank you, all of you who are in our pjnet.tv live chat room. You are a blessing to me and a blessing to each other. It's the best kept secret on the internet. Folks, we'll be back in just a few minutes with JD. Until then, I'd like to ask 2 questions, and in hopes that you will answer these questions to yourself. First, what is the boldest thing you have ever done for Jesus Christ? And secondly, when was it? Folks, it takes boldness to win the battles. We have just heard from a courageous and bold warrior for the kingdom of Christ. And it is my hope and prayer that none of us would ever be satisfied with our answers to those 2 questions.